नमस्कार दोस्तों, फ्रीडम एक्सप्रेस की इस विशेष लाइव में आप सबका स्वागत है। और ये विशेष इसलिए कि अब हम जो बिडेन अंततः अमेरिका के 46वें राष्ट्रपति चुन लिए गए हैं, प्रेसिडेंट इलेक्ट हो गए हैं। और दूसरी बड़ी खुशखबरी ये है कि भारतीय मूल की महिला कमला हैरिस पहली महिला वाइस प्रेसिडेंट बनी है, पहली ब्लैक महिला वाइस प्रेसिडेंट बनी है। वो भारतीय मूल की है। उनकी माता जी, उनकी मदर चेन्नई से बिलोंग करती हैं, तमिलनाडु से बिलोंग करती हैं। वो श्यामला गोपालन, और वो अर्ली 50s में गई थी, बायोलॉजिस्ट हैं वो। और कमला हैरिस का लंबा करियर पॉलिटिकल लाइफ में एज ए लॉयर, और भारत के लिए ये जो है बहुत बड़ी खुशी है दोनों ही तरफ से। और अपने 3 मेहमान हमारे साथ हैं, बहुत खास मेहमान हैं। और जिस वक्त हम बात कर रहे हैं भारत में रात के 12:30 बजे हैं, लेकिन अमेरिका में बहुत सुहानी सुबह हो चुकी है। कुछ वीडियोस में देख रहा हूँ कि जो जश्न का माहौल है व्हाइट हाउस के सामने, और कुछ कोशिश करूंगा कि इस लाइव में वो वीडियो आप लोगों को दिखा पाऊं। और हमारे दोस्त भी बहुत खुश हैं जो अमेरिका से हमारे साथ जुड़े हैं। और मैं जल्दी से परिचय करा दूं और उसके बाद फिर हम आगे बढ़ते हैं अपने डिस्कशन में और सिलेक्शन को समझते हैं और आगे क्या होगा, कैसी पॉलिसीज होंगी, भारत के लिए कैसा है ये चुनाव का परिणाम। तो रोहित त्रिपाठी हमारे साथ हैं, पिछली बार भी लाइव थे। रोहित टेक्नोक्रेट हैं, पब्लिक पॉलिसी एक्सपर्ट हैं और वॉशिंगटन से हमारे साथ जुड़े हैं। रोहित नमस्कार, वेरी गुड मॉर्निंग टू यू।
मॉर्निंग।
और दूसरी हमारी मेहमान है विदिशा विश्वास। विदिशा विश्वास प्रोफेसर है पॉलिटिकल साइंस की सिएटल यूनिवर्सिटी में, और सिएटल से हमारे साथ हैं। मनीष मदान प्रोफेसर क्रिमिनोलॉजी के हैं स्टॉकटन यूनिवर्सिटी के, और न्यू जर्सी से हमारे साथ हैं। तो पहला तो आप सबको बधाई, और पूरे अमेरिका को बधाई, बल्कि पूरे दुनिया को बधाई। इट्स वेरी वंडरफुल मॉर्निंग फॉर अमेरिका, एंड आफ्टर ए वेरी वेरी लॉन्ग नाइट आई वुड से। काफी देर बाद ये सुबह आई है। कैसा लग रहा है रोहित?
मेरी पिछले हफ्ते किसी से बात हो रही थी, और ये अंग्रेजी में एक एनालॉजी है कि देयर इज अ लाइट एट द एंड ऑफ द टनल, लेकिन उसकी कॉरोलरी है ये है कि is that light another train coming at you, or is that the end of the tunnel? And we didn't know कि ट्रेन आ रही है कि रास्ता खुल रहा है, and I think रास्ता थोड़ा खुल रहा है। But on a serious note, I think this is a reprieve. थोड़ी राहत मिली है डेमोक्रेटिक एक्सपेरिमेंट को ग्लोबली, जिससे कहा जा सकता है। और डेफिनेटली अमेरिकन रिपब्लिक के भी जो 250 साल पुराने इंस्टीट्यूशंस थे काफी स्ट्रेस में आ गए थे, एंड आई थिंक कि अगले 4 साल तक तो उन्हें थोड़ी सी रिप्रीव मिलेगी। उसके बाद क्या होगा वी डोंट नो, बट एटलीस्ट आज का जो दिन है काफी लोगों को खुशी से ज्यादा राहत महसूस हो रही है। एंड आई थिंक दैट्स, आई लिव नॉट टू फार अवे फ्रॉम वाशिंगटन डीसी, तो जहाँ बेलम प्लाजा पे ये सारे डेमोन्स्ट्रेशंस हो रहे हैं और खुशियां मनाई जा रही हैं। My kids and I were there just about 2 weeks ago, and it's a powerful place. बिल्कुल व्हाइट हाउस के सामने है, and obviously Trump is not in the White House. He's golfing apparently in Virginia.
हाँ, मैंने अभी देखा तस्वीरों में कि वो उनका मोटरकेड जो है वो आज हेलीकॉप्टर से नहीं गए गोल्फ कोर्स, वो आज कार से गए, और उनका मोटरकेड अभी वापस आ गया है व्हाइट हाउस। और वो कुछ ट्वीट वगैरह करेंगे। उनका एक ट्वीट आया जिसमें वो हार स्वीकार करने को तैयार नहीं है, और जिसमें ट्विटर ने डिस्क्लेमर एक बार फिर लगा दिया है। प्रोफेसर विदिशा, हाउ यू आर फीलिंग नाउ? How you describe this election and the win of Biden?
I feel much like Rohit, and I think much like many people in America and around the world, I feel very relieved. I think the road ahead is difficult, but this is very much a victory for democracy. It's a victory for having every vote count. And today I'm going to be happy with that. And I want to say just last week, just 2 days before the election, I wrote an article where I talked about how Baba Saheb Ambedkar's words should also be words that American voters should heed. That this is a time for us to serve us, meaning American voters, to serve our country by really working together to remove the evils in front of our path. And I think we've gone a little bit, maybe a few centimeters in removing some of those evils.
And how you describe this mandate and this election, Professor Vidisha, soon after, the Barack Obama, the first, the black president in White House, and then now Kamala Harris. So is the American society, moving ahead? How you describe this, the Kamala Harris moment as vice president?
I think this moment is definitely a mandate for saying that Americans are willing to see new faces in their political landscape. But I think it is also, unfortunately for some of us, a mandate to say that not everybody in America is okay with those new faces, right? This was a very, very hard fought win, and it's a legitimate win and it's a real win, but it was not easy. Many of us worked very, very hard for 4 years, almost every day for 4 years to make this happen, and it still came at it was a difficult victory. So yes, it's a mandate for change, but I think it's also a reminder that there's resistance to change as well in America, as well as in many countries around the world.
And India is also looking forward for Kamala Harris. May not be Mr. Modi himself, but the India particularly would be looking for. Professor Manish, quickly, your joy, आपके खुशी क्या है, क्या उसके बाद फिर हम लोग इस इलेक्शन को डाइसेक्ट करते हैं आप लोगों के साथ.
See, I can't stop smiling. When we talked about a few days ago, we were obviously iffy what's going to happen, right? So I agree with both Rohit and Vidisha here. This is a win of democracy. There's no question about that. But above that, this is a victory of less polarization, less divisiveness, and also it's a victory of science, common sense, and fraternity amongst the people. Looking at the broader picture of America being the fountainhead of the politics, as we spoke earlier as well. So this is that victory where people are showing that it's important for us to come together and reject the politics of hate, divisiveness, polarization, and particularly rejecting the politics of othering the communities based on the religion or ethnicity. That's what we have seen in the last 4 years. So from that aspect, I really thank every voter who came in support of the politics that got President-elect Biden and the Vice President-elect Harris now in the saddle. So this is a great day for the American politics, and it also speaks to the integrity of the elections, and it also speaks a lot about the strength of the political system. Given the pandemic times, people were voting in line, in queues at the election centers, but they also voted in huge number with mail-in ballots. So
Yes.
kind of being able to accumulate all those numbers in such an efficient manner. I know it's taken 4 days, but look, if you're looking at like millions of those mail-in ballots and combining everything together and still making sure that the process is absolutely integral, it speaks to the strength of why this country has the most strongest democracy
And
around
the
the world.
verification of postal
Absolutely.
ballots, I was telling my viewers yesterday that
Absolutely.
it is as complicated and as foolproof as passing a check,
Absolutely.
passing a bank
Absolutely.
check.
Absolutely.
Such kind of
Absolutely.
verifications are required.
Absolutely. So no wonder, when we talk about America being the greatest democracy in the world, these are the reasons why we can affirmatively say that today.
Yes.
And there's a lot for other countries to learn from, including India as well.
Yes.
So
In our
I'm very happy. Very happy.
yeah, it must be. And in one of the discussions I was telling yesterday that the Trump was complaining counting of Pennsylvania.
Mhm.
That state is governed by Republican.
Mhm.
The governor and the secretary of state both are Republicans.
Mhm.
That kind of objectivity and impartiality and the neutrality is the American system is really amazing.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm. In fact, if I could just quickly add to that, you may have also seen some of the media networks actually cut down his stream when he started talking about live about questioning the integrity of the election system. That is the kind of independence in the different arenas we see that they cut down that stream because they didn't want to peddle more lies coming right from the White House or from the existing current president, incumbent president.
Yes, of course. तो रोहित जी, मैं अगर इलेक्शन को अभी हम लोग इसके इलेक्शन के फॉल आउट डिस्कस करेंगे अगले फेज में प्रोग्राम के, और उसके इंडिया के और ग्लोबल जियो पॉलिटिक्स में क्या उसके असर होंगे वो हम लोग डिस्कस करेंगे। ट्रम्प का भविष्य क्या होगा, रिपब्लिकन पार्टी का भविष्य क्या होगा, तो लेकिन उसके पहले थोड़ा सा इस मैंडेट को हम लोग समझते हैं अपने भारतीय व्यूअर्स के लिए। तो पहली चीज तो ये समझ में आती है कि ये रेड और ब्लू, तो ये ब्लू केवल किनारे क्यों है और रेड बीच में क्यों है? व्हाई दिस हार्ट ऑफ अमेरिका इज नॉट डेमोक्रेट?
This is a complicated question. I think geography is a very important factor in the United States, but what does geography do? कि अगर आप कोस्टल एरियाज में हैं या उनसे थोड़े पास हैं तो आपकी जिंदगी में क्या फर्क है कंपेयर टू जो लोग हार्टलैंड में हैं? तो it's a very complicated question. I don't think we'll have time to look at all of those things. But I would just say at a high level कि even the areas जो coastal areas हैं, Florida the coastal area है, Florida went to Trump. So there are two factors here, I would say. At a high level, you should see कि even the coastal areas, and as you started coming in, so Georgia, for example, is on the East Coast, and it was very, very tight. Actually, Biden won that right now. I mean, provisionally speaking, 4,000 votes hai. I mean, 4-5 million vote में से 4,000 vote is nothing. It's absolutely nothing. And they're doing an automatic recount. So geographic divide ये है कि जैसे ही rural होते जाते हैं, socio-culturally, चीजें change होती जाती हैं. Rural voters are more conservative. They're slightly more disconnected कि बाहर दुनिया में क्या हो रहा है, उनकी अपनी दुनिया है. And there's a lot of fear mongering that unfortunately the Republican Party has used through its media outlets कि उनको उस एक ऐसे bubble में रखो जहाँ पे they are constantly under threat from minorities, from other urban dwellers. So जो rural urban divide है उसको manufacture भी काफी किया गया है और उन परेशानियों को काफी amplify किया गया है. So that's one reason why I think there is that divide. So I'm glad you're showing the map. And you can see Georgia जो है अभी blue में है. But then again, what's interesting is कि on the West Coast, आप देखिए Arizona, I mean, and Colorado and Nevada, they're becoming, I don't want to say Arizona is reliably, democratic, लेकिन Arizona जो है पिछले 2 इलेक्शन से ट्रेंड कर रहा है more and more democratic, और इस वक्त Arizona has 2 democratic senators and Biden won the state. It's a very small margin, but your trend lines hai, and the Texas is showing red, but even Texas is now moving towards that. So, but if you look at within Texas, if you pick any state in particular, what will be interesting is कि जो urban areas हैं, वो बहुत deep blue हैं, और बाकी जो landscape है, जहाँ पे ज़्यादा लोग रहते नहीं हैं, but फिर भी there is a population there, they are red. So the rural-urban divide is very significant beyond the east-west divide or the north-south divide within the United States. So that's what I would stop. I think विश्लेषण करना कि the poor in rural areas, why do they vote Republican? उस पे तो किताबें लिखी गई हैं, and I think Vidisha is a much more astute observer of that, and which is a much deeper topic to cover. But to me, that's really the thing. It's more of the urban-rural divide rather than the geographic divide, and then urbanization has its own socioeconomic metrics that people track. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Professor Vidisha, just, I want to understand more about this red and blue, and for our viewers also. And what I could see from India and whatever appearing in media or elsewhere, I could get a sense that, it's a huge working class and rural population, as Rohit was mentioning. And the Democratic Party, especially Democratic campaign of Biden, was not raising those issues of, very high cost of education, the healthcare, the employment issues, the kind of issues Bernie Sanders used to raise, the kind of issues Elizabeth Warren used to raise. So I get a feeling that, this somehow, this, the Wall Street is going to have a big role. Again, this insurance lobbies, hedge funds, nothing is going to change. So this red zone is not just, a cowboys or anti-abortionist, or they are poor farmers. They need lots of support and opinion making. In last discussion, we were discussing about the opinion making cities of America. New York, Los Angeles, Washington, all these are blue. So how you describe this phenomena of red versus blue?
Um, I think actually you mentioned Pennsylvania. I think Pennsylvania is a good place to explain that, just because it's a state that incorporates a lot of these different forces that you mentioned. Now, so Pennsylvania has two very large urban areas, Pittsburgh on one side and Philadelphia on the other. And then in the middle, it's deeply rural, right? So if you kind of look at even the breakdown for Trump and Biden this time, or for Trump and Hillary last time, the city areas and the suburbs went very strongly for the Democratic candidate, and the rural areas went very strongly for the Republican candidate, less so this time. But I want to say that I don't think it is true that the Democratic Party has neglected the concerns of the American poor, right? And in fact, most of their policies compared to the Republican Party has been much more about lowering the cost of healthcare, for example. So it's not as if the Republican Party is giving economic solutions that the Democratic Party is not giving. What the Republican Party is giving, and this is, I think, common in many countries, including in India, is a sense of cultural pride, right? So the difference between the two parties is not that Republicans are better in addressing the concern of the small farmer. The difference is that the Republican Party is going to rural America and stoking these very strong kind of religious and racial divisions. That's what they're offering. That is what Donald Trump is offering. And it's people, for whatever reason, like to listen to that. As far as Wall Street is concerned, I think Wall Street benefits no matter what. Right, Republican wins, Democrat wins, somebody else wins. They're always, they're going to be on top because elections are expensive, because they fund a lot of candidates. But money speaks. But leaving that aside, I do think that the Democrat Party's solutions have for a long time and continue to be better catering to the interests of those who are economically struggling. The problem is that the Republican Party controls large chunks of the media and the social media, and what they are winning on is fear of people of color, fear of women, fear of things changing in America. That's their trump card.
Okay. Manish, आप इसको कैसे समझते हैं? जैसे मैं अगर देखूं कि आर्कसांस में क्लिंटन वहां से आए थे, उसके गवर्नर थे, वहां से प्रेसिडेंट बने. Now that state also, for 3 elections it became red. So क्या ये अगर बर्नी सैंडर्स होते तो कुछ बीच में ब्लू स्पॉट्स दिखते बीच?
I think two things here. One is what Bidisha was talking about. What Trump has done is the ethno-nationalism, right? Stoking fear based on ethnicity and religion. Taking the cue from what you're saying, Bernie Sanders, his policies were more of, let's say, make college education free, right? Very socialist policies, so as to speak of from what he came across. And I think what really strengthened this particular victory for Biden is because there was an agreement. You could see that how the whole force of Bernie Sanders and Liz Warren were like, we want to support at this point the Democratic ticket, and whatever policies we want to bring in, we will start working on them once we are into the position of power. And which is what, if you remember, sort of lacked during last election of 2016, when Hillary Clinton didn't get that kind of support from Bernie Sanders' policy, so as to speak of. So I feel that as much as it is important at this point that we have the victory in Biden and Harris, the policy shift we will eventually see, because the kind of narrative that Bernie Sanders and Liz Warren policies has brought to this country, it will find some roots in moving forward. A few years ago, nobody could talk about free education, nobody could talk about free healthcare, for example. Obviously that started with Obamacare, And as Bidisha mentioned, I 100% agree with that. Democrat on the other side has been more pro people and more pro, I would say, people who are from the lower economic backgrounds also. So if that kind of makes sense here.
हाँ बिल्कुल, बर्नी सैंडर्स जो इश्यूज उठा रहे हैं, जाहिर सी बात है कि उनका असर तो रहेगा, वो कैंडिडेट नहीं थे तो भी, और पॉलिसी मेकिंग में उनका असर होगा। दूसरे की बहुत बड़ी लॉबी है लिबरल्स की डेमोक्रेट पार्टी के अंदर, उन सब का होगा। दूसरे की जिस मीडिया ने, जिस प्रेस ने सपोर्ट किया, इतना बेइज्जती उठा के ट्रम्प की और इतना स्टैंड लेके, इट वाज अनप्रेसिडेंटेड इन अमेरिका। आज सुबह तक ये हुआ। रोहित में एक और, अब बर्नी जब, क्योंकि ये जो बिडेन आ गए हैं, तो अब इनका ये कैसे प्रेसिडेंट होंगे, थोड़ा इस पे हम लोग आपसे बात करना चाह रहे हैं कि ये पहले प्रेसिडेंट है मेरे ख्याल से, पिछले कई अगर 3-4 प्रेसिडेंट देखें आप, जिनको कांग्रेस में दोनों हाउसेस का सपोर्ट नहीं है। यानी अगर ट्रम्प भी जो बने थे, तो ट्रम्प के पास भी शुरू के 2 साल सीनेट थी
जी,
और बराक ओबामा के पास भी सीनेट और हाउस दोनों थे। सीनेट में मेजॉरिटी नहीं आई डेमोक्रेट्स की, अभी तक ऐसा लग रहा है। तो अगर सीनेट में मेजॉरिटी नहीं आएगी तो सारे अपॉइंटमेंट जो है सीनेट अप्रूव करती है, सेक्रेटरी ऑफ स्टेट हो, कॉमर्स सेक्रेटरी हो, इंडस्ट्री सेक्रेटरी हो, तो ये अप्रूवल्स नहीं आएंगे, उनके बिल्स रुकेंगे, तो वो जो प्रॉमिसेस करके आए हैं वो कैसे फुलफिल करेंगे?
सो सेनेट का जो मामला है, जो लोग क्लोजली फॉलो कर रहे हैं, और अब आई थिंक पिछले 4-5 दिन में पूरी दुनिया एक्सपर्ट हो गई है अमेरिकन पॉलिटिक्स में, खासकर जॉर्जिया की पॉलिटिक्स में। सो राइट नाउ द सेनेट बैलेंस इज, लेट्स से 48-48। देयर आर 2 रेसेस जो कि रिपब्लिकन्स मोस्ट लाइकली जीत जाएंगे, जो कॉल नहीं हुई है, नॉर्थ कैरोलिना एंड अलास्का। सो इट विल बी 50-48। बट इंटरेस्टिंगली जॉर्जिया में 2 सेनेट रेसेस चल रही थी, और दोनों में किसी भी कैंडिडेट ने 50% क्रॉस नहीं किया, तो वो ऑटोमेटिकली, जिसे कहते हैं रन ऑफ, री इलेक्शन होगा जस्ट फॉर द टॉप 2 कैंडिडेट्स। सो दैट्स हैपनिंग ऑन January 5th। सो January 5th को अगर डेमोक्रेट्स दोनों सीटें जीत जाते हैं, देन द सेनेट बिकम्स 50-50, and the Senate becomes 50-50, and Kamala Harris, who will be the vice president, breaks the tie, then the Democrats technically have the majority. So basically, अगर आप American election follow कर रहे हैं, not just the presidential part, but the entire process, this is not over until the 5th of January, fortunately or unfortunately. So we'll have to see, and those both races are going to be pretty tight. पूरी political universe की निगाहें जो हैं वहीं पे होंगी for the next 2 months, and that will be very tight. But let's say कि Democrats सत्ता में नहीं आते हैं, I think it's a tough situation because and I think this is where आपने जो पहला एक सवाल पूछा था कि Republicans का क्या होगा, so that will be a moment for Republicans to figure out what they want to do, because let's say worst case scenario, Democrats are down 50-48. Yes, the Senate majority leader, जो कि is effectively the Speaker of the Senate and controls the agenda of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, he's an obstructionist. He was hell bent on making sure कि Barack Obama का कोई agenda आगे न जाए, and so on and so forth. He could do that. He was just re-elected, and लोगों का but he has been a long time, I won't say friend, but associate of Joe Biden. Remember, Joe Biden जो है Senate में उन्होंने बहुत साल बताया, since the age of 29 till he became vice president, a good solid 35 plus years he's been in the Senate. He knows the senators, Mitch McConnell and those guys really, really well. Kamala Harris herself is a senator right now. So, a lot of people are saying if there's anybody in the Democratic Party who can work with Mitch McConnell to, for example, get a relief package out because of COVID. COVID, to unfortunately, we have 120,000 cases every day for the last 3 days. It's like absolutely exploding in the United States right now. But the hope is that Biden will find a way of figuring out some common interests with Mitch McConnell. He got elected just now for 6 more years, so he's not under any pressure to get re-elected. He does love his Senate majority position, but he has to figure out if he continues to be obstructionist and he sees the writing on the wall. The Democrats are trending, in states that Republicans have held so far. Like the next election in Texas can go Democratic. The next election in Georgia, North Carolina. I mean, there's so many states. Arizona already har chuke hain. He has to see the writing on the wall. So what does he want his legacy to be? Now, people like Mitch McConnell don't really have a legacy. They don't want to have a legacy. Conservatives have already gotten 3 Supreme Court, judges confirmed. So they have a majority for at least a good couple of decades. They got a huge corporate tax cut. So in some sense, Donald Trump has delivered on the conservative agenda. So it'll be very interesting to see अब Mitch McConnell क्या करना चाहते हैं, Republicans अब और क्या करना चाहते हैं? Do they really want to be a party of obstruction, or do they really want to be a party of governance? So it's up in the air. Let's see what happens.
Let's see how this Lincoln project will still be revived, or it will die its natural death after the Trump is out of scene. Professor Vidisha, how the world would look like now, because the Trump gave an impression that America can run on autopilot for 4 years. So the foreign policy, the global role of America. I remember the Merkel was saying that the Trump is no longer interested in global scenario. So how there are challenges at the global level. The Iran thing has been messed up by Trump. The relations with India is are very the headline making relations. The real terms, the relations are going bad in terms of trade, in terms of the termination of GSP, all these things. So how this new era of Biden the world would look like?
I think that in some ways I'm more optimistic about the foreign policy scenario of a Biden administration than the domestic policy. Joe Biden himself is very experienced in foreign policy. He's very experienced in US-India relations. He knows how foreign policy works, and foreign leaders know him and trust him as someone who's reliable. So I think no doubt the world is heaving a sigh of relief, but I also think that he is more able and willing to kind of deliver a consistent, reliable foreign policy for the US. He's more able and willing to work on climate change, on COVID, on kind of
WHO,
working with China, but also limiting China. And I think in that sphere, also the Republicans are going to be less obstructionist towards him than they were towards Obama, because Obama, they just hated Obama. So anything he did, Iran nuclear deal, climate change accord, if Obama did it, it was wrong. I don't think they're going to be like that with Biden, for not least because Biden is a white man and not a black man. I'm sorry to say that I think that strand runs pretty deep in the Republican Party. So the problem, I think, is that in the last 4 years, I think the world has come to know a lot about how dysfunctional American politics is. So I think the world will know that if Democrats don't take over the Senate, the Senate approves treaties. And so they're going to still be blocking Biden's efforts to work with Iran, to work on climate change. And the Republican Party doesn't even want to accept that there's climate change, right? Yes. So I trust Joe Biden and his team to have the ability to put forward a good foreign policy vision. I do not trust the willingness of the Republican Party to be a good partner in that. So it could be.
Do you think that the things with Iran, the way Barack Obama moved ahead with Iran, and that is very crucial for the Middle East peace process. So how Joe Biden take first few steps for Iran?
I think it's a difficult one. Biden himself worked hard to make the Iran nuclear deal happen. So I think he would want to say on day one that we want to be back in the deal. But if I was the Iranian government, I would say, why should I believe you? In 4 years, you could be gone. In 2 years, you could lose both the House and the Senate. So I think there's some convincing that needs to happen. I think Iran would like the US to be back in the deal. Everybody wants the US to be back in the deal. Biden wants the US to be back in the deal. So I think this election is good news for the deal. What I don't know is how credible is America's promise on the international stage anymore, because we've seen that, things just go, Trump undid US foreign policy in a way that we have not seen in the past. But given that he did it, it's very possible that the Republican Party will continue to just look to, like Rohit said, obstruct what the Democratic Party does. So on the one hand, I'm optimistic for the deal, but on the other hand, outside of America, I would wonder how long is the Biden-Harris administration going to be around? Like that's really what it comes down to. And we've never seen this before in America, where foreign policy is another issue which is polarizing, right? If the Democrats say climate change, Republicans will say no climate change. If Democrats say work with Iran, Republicans will say no work with Iran. And it's got nothing to do with the foreign policy reality and everything to do with domestic politics. And that's going to be a challenge for President Biden.
मनीष, इसी सवाल को हम आपसे भी एक्सप्लोर करते हैं कि कितना ट्रंप ने फॉरेन पॉलिसी के स्तर पे बिगाड़ा है चीजों को, और उसको कितना क्विकली रीअसेंबल पहले तो करना है जो बाइडेन को, और उसके बाद ही हैज टू ब्रिंग हिज ओन विजन टू द टेबल. सो व्हाट वुड बी हिज विजन? उनका क्या नजरिया होगा मिडिल ईस्ट पीस प्रोसेस को लेकर, ईरान को लेकर, इंडिया के साथ ताल्लुकात को लेकर, ये सारे इश्यूज पे, WHO को लेकर, यूनाइटेड नेशंस की रीस्ट्रक्चरिंग को लेकर?
See, actually, I think for that, we have to first understand Trump's political narrative that we saw in the last 4 years. His political narrative stayed around, quote unquote, America first, right? In which he almost gave up the America's foreign policy or America's positioning as the world superpower, or as the one who could call the shots. So I think the first real challenge for President-elect Biden and his team would be to bring back the narrative that we are looking forward to reestablish our global presence, right? For example, when I believe when Trump actually withdrew from NATO also, right, he questioned about the WHO as well. So bringing back those narratives to see that how we're going to have our voice back, our position back as a global superpower will be extremely, extremely important. So that's one shift really the Biden's campaign will have to make, or his political narrative will have to make. The second, I'm not much expert on the Iranian aspect that Vidisha probably spoke more articulately on, but I will definitely can speak about from the Indian perspective. From an Indian perspective, Trump was actually good news for Modi's politics, because Modi and Trump were pretty much in the same ballpark of their political agendas. So, we had questionability on the Article 370, we had the questionability on the Citizenship Amendment Act, which we saw were hugely polarizing and hugely divisive politics that we saw. And in that aspect, you saw pretty much Trump never gave any statement against the human rights violation that happened in Jammu Kashmir as a result of the Article 370. There was not a single statement about the constitutional invalidity of the Citizenship Amendment Act from Trump's campaign. And to that effect, even when he went to India, we saw obviously a daily program, there was no statement whatsoever. However, on the contrary, there have been many representatives within the United States, including, if I recall correctly, Lindsey Graham, who have written letters about their objectionability on the Citizenship Amendment Act, as an example. For that matter, even Vice President-elect Kamala Harris has spoken against the Article 370 politics that happened. And I believe, if I recall correctly, she's also spoken against the Citizenship Amendment Act, following the lead from Pramila Jayapal. So in that aspect, what you see is, and what we spoke even last time, how Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, in fact, Joe Biden has himself given statement during his electoral, campaign period, that how he does not support the Article 370 politics or the CAA. So now, from a foreign policy perspective, particularly as it relates to India, I see that there will be pretty much a cross between the American leadership and the Indian leadership. So the question is, how will that impact those business relationships, those trade relationships? Obviously, the time will tell. But from a social justice perspective, from a human rights perspective, like I've said before, Biden and Harris are pretty much on top of those on those particular aspects, which unfortunately Modi's government is not. So there will be some sort of discord there. Now, how will that in the long run impact the foreign policy relationship between the two countries? Again, the time will tell. We already saw that Narendra Modi has congratulated President-elect, so that diplomacy will go. that's the strength of the Modi's government also, that they're very strong on the diplomacy skills, across the world. We have seen that. But again, I think it will be time to see now whether Vice President-elect Harris or President Biden will make the same noise. I mean, we as Indian Americans, we would hope that they continue to champion on the social justice and human rights issues as it relates to India, and use their leverage, use their power of being, from the world's, as we say, from the United States of America, to bring some positive change in our own country back in India. But it will be time to see how it really impacts the policy shift from the Indian perspective. Just because now Harris or Biden says that we are not happy with the CAA, will that really have a change in the hearts of the Indian government? We don't know that. The time will have to tell that. But at least to some degree, I think it will definitely influence a common man or woman on the street, when they hear from those voices from America. So that's kind of my take on how it will impact the foreign policy, particularly vis-a-vis India and US.
प्रशांत जी, मैं एक बात कहूँ जरा।
जी, मैं आप ही से सवाल पूछ रहा था, आप अपनी बात तो कह दें, लेकिन मैं आपसे आप ही से अगला सवाल पूछ रहा था। लेकिन आपसे सवाल पूछने से पहले एक मुझे याद आ रहा, क्योंकि ये भारत के बारे में डिस्कस करते हैं ज्यादा, इस नतीजे का इम्पैक्ट भारत में क्या होगा, और मुझे वो याद आ रहा था कि अब की बार ट्रंप सरकार, मोदी साहब ने कहा, और जिसको अंग्रेजी में कहें कि मोदी हैज पुट ऑल हिज एग्स इन वन बास्केट and the bottom of the basket has slipped now.
Right.
So वो कितनी समझदारी थी भारत की फॉरेन पॉलिसी की, इस हद तक जाना कि डोमेस्टिक पॉलिटिक्स में इन्वॉल्व हो जाए हमारे प्राइम मिनिस्टर। और अब क्योंकि कमला हैरिस हैं जिन्होंने बहुत क्रिटिकल रही है, जैसा प्रोफेसर मनीष ने बताया, तो एक तो ये कि जो पॉलिटिकल रिलेशंस हैं, जो पॉलिटिकल एडवांटेजेस ट्रंप के साथ थे, ट्रंप के साथ इकोनॉमिक एडवांटेजेस नहीं थे, ट्रंप के साथ पॉलिटिकल एडवांटेजेस थे नरेंद्र मोदी के, वो अब शायद नहीं मिलेंगे। और दूसरे की 3 हिस्सों में अगर हम रिलेशंस को बांटे, एक तो पॉलिटिकल रिलेशंस जो प्रोफेसर मनीष ने जिस तरह इशारा किया, कश्मीर या CA/NRC या माइनॉरिटीज के इश्यूज पे, दूसरा ट्रेड एंड कॉमर्स के रिलेशंस, वो ट्रंप के समय में बहुत खराब हुए। मतलब वो एक मोटरसाइकिल के इशू को लेके इतना इन्वॉल्व हो गए कि वो फैक्ट्री भी यहाँ बंद हो गई और GSP भी उन्होंने टर्मिनेट कर दिया, जिससे इंडियन ऑटोमोबाइल सेक्टर को, एसेसरीज की बहुत इम्पैक्ट हुआ है उसका, बहुत छोटी छोटी इंडस्ट्रीज यहाँ बंद हो गई उसके बाद दूसरा कि जो ग्लोबल प्रेजेंस है इंडिया की, जहाँ पे मल्टीलेटरल एंगेजमेंट है अमेरिका के साथ, जैसे अफगानिस्तान का पीस प्रोसेस, अब उसमें इंडियन रोल नहीं रहा। प्रोफेसर विदिशा से भी सवाल मैं करूंगा, उसमें रोल नहीं रहा, जबकि हमारा काफी स्टेक्स है अफगानिस्तान में, हमारे 4-4, 5-5 वहाँ पे मिशंस हैं और हमारी वहाँ पे इन्फ्लुएंस है। तो कैसे आप रोहित इसको देख रहे हैं कि इंडियन पर्सपेक्टिव में और इस इलेक्शन के आउटकम को?
सो जो बाइडेन जो हैं वो उस स्कूल ऑफ थॉट से आते हैं, उस विचारधारा से आते हैं दैट द यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स इज एन इंडिस्पेंसिबल नेशन। उसका क्या मतलब होता है कि ग्लोबल लीडरशिप में, हर ग्लोबल कॉन्फ्लिक्ट में यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स की या तो अहम भूमिका हो या कोई महत्वपूर्ण भूमिका हो। और द प्रॉब्लम इज कि पिछले 4 साल से द यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स हैज बीन फिक्सेटेड ऑन इंटरनल पॉलिटिक्स, कि पूरा ध्यान अंदर की घरेलू राजनीति पे रहा है, क्योंकि प्रेसिडेंट ट्रंप ने काफी इंटरनल इश्यूज को उठाया है। he has obviously isolated the United States from the outside. So what's happened is that कि internally politically एक नया progressive narrative आया, जैसे मनीष ने बताया, AOC है, आपने बर्नी सैंडर्स हैं, एलिजाबेथ वॉरेन हैं, तो the progressive internal narrative has gained a lot of steam. However, कोई foreign policy में कोई progressive narrative नहीं आया है, and that will be something interesting to see, because Joe Biden का रिफ्लेक्सिव रिएक्शन होगा कि वी शुड बिकम मल्टीलैटरल अगेन। ठीक है, आप हो गए, पर आपका बेसिस क्या है मल्टीलैटरल बनने का? डू यू जस्ट वांट टू सीट एट द टेबल एंड जस्ट से व्हाटएवर यू वांट टू से, बट व्हाट इज द लॉजिक ऑफ योर टॉकिंग? आई मीन, अगर आप इंडिया से एंगेज करेंगे, आपने चुनाव जीता है माइनॉरिटीज के बल पे भी, ओके, उनकी राइट्स को लेके, उनका सोशियो इकोनॉमिक स्टेटस को लेके, तो जब आप इंडिया से बात करेंगे तो आप क्या उसे भूल जाएंगे? कि आपने घर पे क्या किया, और will you act like a sadly an imperial power कि हमारी डेमोक्रेसी अलग है, तुम्हारी डेमोक्रेसी बिल्कुल अलग है. So that kind of, I mean, and that's one thing that, I written an article on Kamala Harris some time back, and I think that is the pressure that she will face. You cannot be anymore, you cannot be disingenuous कि आप यहाँ पे कुछ एक बात, मानव अधिकारों की बात करते हैं, सोशियो इकोनॉमिक, इनइक्वालिटी की बात करते हैं, पर जैसे ही आपने फॉरेन पॉलिसी का रुख अपनाया और सडनली आपके वैल्यू सिस्टम चेंज हो जाता है. And that's going to be a real challenge. And that was a problem with, the Biden-Obama administration at times. That they felt that they can sustain the same American foreign policy, which was not popular around the world after they got elected, but their progressive forces were completely focused on the internal democracy, on the internal side. So I think कि दुनिया जो है ग्लोबलाइज हो चुकी है, YouTube हर जगह पहुंच चुका है, Twitter हर जगह पहुंच चुका है, तो any kind of a hypocrisy on this will be called out. And I think कि जैसे मनीष ने बताया कि there are enough progressive elected representatives in the United States who are aware of what is happening in India, what is happening in other societies where these rights, these institutions are under threat. They will speak up and challenge these guys. And I think, hopefully towards the end of the program, we should talk about कि the Democratic Party में जो अंदर अभी होने वाला है अगले 4 साल में, it's going to be monumental. It is, I mean, I know it's आज हम लोग चुनाव अभी खत्म हुआ है, जीते हैं, 2024 की बातें already शुरू हो रही हैं. Will Kamala Harris be the candidate or not? And those are things that there are real questions. But I think the only takeaway I would say is कि जो hypocrisy है, internal, external, वो अब छुप नहीं पाएगी. So this is where I really want to see what is it that Biden articulates. And one question, I mean, I love my friend Manish, and थोड़ा exception लूँगा मैं Manish said around Indian diplomacy. It's a very superficial diplomacy. Yeah, I mean, I know हमारे प्रधानमंत्री लोगों को happy birthday कहने में कभी चूकते नहीं हैं. But India is isolated in its entire neighborhood. एक ढंग का ally हमारा बचा नहीं है. And that says something about diplomacy. There is a shallowness to diplomacy. There is a, a decorative element to diplomacy, and then there's a substantive element to diplomacy.
Right.
If India wants to be a great nation, it has to be a regional leader. There is no example in history of any great nation which has not been a regional leader. I mean, there's just none, and there won't be any. You have to expand your own, sphere of influence in a meaningful, collaborative, multilateral way for that aspiration to be realized. And I think it'll be interesting to see, and I love to hear about what Vidisha and Manish say. The China angle is going to be very critical. I think, the United States will go back to the Obama-Biden model of China, engage karte raho, unko thoda, let them manipulate the currency a little bit, but it won't be as confrontational. And then it'll be interesting to see what China does in response. Now that the US is now at bay, do they really want to, pick a fight with India, which really doesn't deliver much to them? So I think it's an open question how, the United States, stays engaged with them, because it may not see India as a bulwark anymore, because it may not see China as a threat anymore, as big as it was before. So we'll have to see.
See, if I can quickly respond to that, may I? Yeah, I think two things. When I talked about the diplomacy skills, Modi's politics, as I've written about it extensively, in different articles, it is more to do with bling bling politics, right? Which is that wherever you can make a lot more noise, wherever you can get a lot more traction, that's where it will be totally devoid of substance. There is no question about that. But case in point, I'll say a few months ago, when there was this whole noise of people threatening and making Islamophobic comments from Gulf countries, and one of the princesses had actually taken a note of that from UAE, I believe. And immediately the Indian government worked their channels up, and I believe the High Commissioner in probably Mr. Vineet or Mr. Vinay, I'm forgetting the name here, he came out with a statement of saying that, we believe in inclusivity, we do this, we do that. That is an example of a diplomacy, that how it worked in the back end, and the kind of things pretty much subsided down there. So, so that's where I say that, number one. Number two, so yes, I totally agree with you. There is no substance in Modi's politics. We have seen that in the last 6 years. You can look at any metrics, whether it's about the hunger, about the poverty, about the infrastructure, about the economy, about employment, you name it, and we are in the doldrums. There is no question about that. The second part is about relating the global impact, as you mentioned about it. What we have to understand, and what Indians have to understand within India, is that this whole politics of this nationalistic narrative will not work now. the nationalistic narrative of Trump, which was America first, it did not work anymore. It cannot work in a post-globalization era that we live in. And that is the narrative that even Modi's government has tried to bring in, that India first. We are a service nation. We depend on a lot of different other countries for trade, for economy, for employment, for different transactions, what have we. So in that process, this whole notion of India first just cannot work and will not operate. So India will also have to shed, and hopefully what the country, what Americans have done is rejected that narrative of America first, right? Because we are living in this post-globalization period, and you will see that. And I'm fairly optimistic. Come about 2024, we will see that political shift even within Indians to looking at that. How we do need to work with different countries on different issues. So that's my response to Rohit's question or his commentary about the whole diplomacy, and the other part was
Professor Bidisha, just what Rohit has elaborated very nicely about the India's engagement now, the possible India's engagement in Biden's time. Adding to that, I just want to quickly go through the Islamophobia also, which Trump has contributed a lot. So how the Biden, of course, would undo all these things, but how far he would be succeeding in that? And number one. Number two, more about the India policy. We have the Kashmir issue, which has been internationalized. There are voices in America, very, very progressive voices in America. Now those voices would be, louder. They would be amplified now. All these human rights voices will be amplified now. Especially when CA and RC things are happening in India, especially when the minorities are being attacked. So we hear lots of voices in America. Those voices will now have ears in establishment. So how the political establishment would react to these things under Biden?
Well, I think there's no doubt that the Biden-Harris administration will speak up much more for human rights, in that it will speak up for human rights, which the Trump administration didn't do. I think with regard to India and the CAA, NRC, Kashmir, I think it's also important to note that the Indian diaspora in America is very divided on Indian politics, right? So you have one group, the Howdy Modi group, that has been very loud. But you have this other group that I think many of us represent that has been very critical of the Indian government's policies. And under Trump, we didn't have much of a ear in Washington, D.C., because the Trump administration didn't really care about our viewpoints. They cared about, Christian interests, or, they cared to some extent about the human rights of Christian missionaries in other countries, but that was it, right? So I think now we will have more of a voice in a Biden-Harris administration. And I think that is good for everybody. At the same time, I would say that, the Indian government is not, let me put this another way. I don't think the Biden-Harris administration is going to make human rights in India the pillar of its foreign policy, right? It's, they have very strong defense interests, they have very strong business interests in India that they're looking to build up. So that will come first. I think that the Modi government is going to find that they're not going to be able to get away with things in the way that they did under the Trump administration. But the core issue between India and the US is really going to be more about rebuilding the economic and the defense cooperation, and that's going to be the focus. But I do look forward to working with an administration that is more willing to listen to those of us Indian Americans who want to say that, hey, what the BJP government is doing is not acceptable to us. And for 4 years, we have had to be a little bit not silenced, but we haven't got the voice that I think the Howdy Modi crowd did for so long.
Although I would like to add that I believe that with this election, the Howdy Modi crowd would have been neutral to some extent.
Yeah.
Yes.
I've read, how, I don't know how far this data is correct, but the media reports are saying that around 80% of Indians voted for Democrats.
Absolutely. And that's been traditional, and that has been the traditional statistics. We spoke about that last interview.
So that data speaks about Howdy Modi's, the strength in America.
Right.
Okay.
प्रशांत जी उसमें एक nuance है तो मिलन and Devesh Kapoor, Milan Vaishnav and Devesh Kapoor, and I forget the name of the third author, they did a survey, and जो Biden और Democrats जो हैं, a majority of them still, जो Biden और Democrat supporters हैं, a majority of them still have a favorable opinion of Modi.
Yeah,
So
maybe.
it's not as straightforward just because, and this is the, I mean, you know, the diaspora's hypocrisy. You know, we'll pretend to be progressive here, but when it comes to
the
majority,
interest in America is something else, and interest in
yeah,
India
that's a real
something.
thing. That's a very real thing. Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
But you see, if go ahead, Vidisha, then I can go after you.
Oh, I just want to say that I wanted to agree fully with Rohit that, you know, Modi's foreign policy has been very weak. It's been about salesmanship, as Manish said. So I think, you know, so many years of him having been prime minister, I think the weaknesses of his salesmanship versus delivery, it is becoming more and more clear to the rest of the world. So I do not see a Biden administration hitching its wagon to supporting Modi in the way that Trump
Professor Vidisha, we lost, you know, H1B visa. We lost GSP. We lost, you know, many things, you know. And then the president is, you know, coming and shouting on malaria drugs, coming and shouting on, you know, saying something else to India is a filthy country. I don't think this salesmanship, you know, was more of the headline management.
Exactly.
Professor Manish,
Yes.
before I take you to your, you know, point of view, I just want to add one thing, and I want you to react on that. कि चाइना से डील, जैसे कि रोहित ने बताया, प्रोफेसर विदिशा ने बताया कि चाइना से बाइडेन का डील को डिफरेंट नहीं होगा, ट्रम्प से पॉलिसी डिफरेंट नहीं होगी, मे बी, यू नो, द पैकेजिंग, द बॉडी लैंग्वेज, द हेडलाइन मैनेजमेंट वुड बी डिफरेंट, but you know, the China would remain a competition for America, and in that scenario, India becomes a very important destination because of the size of the market, because of, you know, the technological advancement in India, and very strong diaspora back in America. तो क्या चाइना से engagement पर इंडिया को बाइडेन से कुछ फायदा होने जा रहा है?
I don't think so. My reason is that strategically, yes, one could think about if the relationship with China is south, then obviously then India becomes the natural market. But the question is India ready for it? That's the question. You know, we talk about, for example, the Make in India campaign that Modi government had been doing for the last 6 years. Has it really done any benefit for the industry to come up? So whatever the American market needs, from whether it's from China or India, the question is, will the Indian market be ready for that? You know, if it is ready for that, then certainly it would be in an advantageous position. But I don't see that happening in the last 6 years, and I don't know how it will change in the next, you know, few years or so. So that's kind of my response to that. And going back to your immigration point, and from the foreign policy perspective, we do know that the Kamala Harris was very supportive of the lifting of the H-1B caps, and particularly because Indians obviously are one of the most predominant, you know, disproportionately they come into this country on the H-1Bs. So that's been her supporting line to remove the cap. And number two, she's also been supportive of what they call is the employment rights for the spouses of H-1B visas. As many of our viewers may know, that the spouses of H-1B, which are on H-4Bs, they cannot work until the spouse has had an EAD or a green card. Now, and by lifting those employment rights for those H-4B visas, I think that is something where Kamala Harris has shown a lot of support, and that is where one would hope that Modi government is able to engage with them, you know, as part of the foreign policy, and use their stance towards that to the advantage of that will serve obviously many Indians who are capable and have the skill sets to come and, you know, work in this country. That's my position there.
रोहित, मैं अब आखिरी के विदिशा, Professor, please go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly, I just want to say that, you know, immigration is a very controversial issue in the US right now. And I think with so much unemployment in the US, you know, the H-1B expansion, I know the Biden-Harris administration talked about it, and I don't think they'll be cutting it down, but I also think that they need to be domestically a little bit careful about how it plays out with the American public. You know, even if it's not hurting American jobs, if, you know, people start thinking that, oh, you're giving more jobs to Indians when Americans need jobs. So I think that kind of nationalism, protectionism in a recession is to be expected. Right.
Right.
और प्रोग्राम के आखिर में जल्दी जल्दी हम लोग एक और बात डिस्कस कर लेते हैं, बहुत डिटेल में बात इंडिया के बारे में हो गई, अमेरिका की डोमेस्टिक पॉलिटिक्स के बारे में हो गई। ट्रम्प चुनाव हार चुके हैं और अमेरिका का कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन ये नहीं कहता है कि वो हारने वाला खुद हार में कबूल करे तभी हार मानी जाएगी, लेकिन ट्रम्प सीन से बाहर नहीं होंगे। ट्रम्प जितना कर गए 4 साल में, तो ये दुनिया कैसे डिसमेंटल करेगी रोहित। और दूसरी एक इम्पॉर्टेंट बात ये है कि ये ट्रम्प जो पोस्ट ट्रूथ की पॉलिटिक्स आई, ट्रम्प उसके बादशाह थे, लेकिन उसका असर ब्राजील में भी गया, उसका असर स्पेन में भी गया, उसका असर इंडिया में भी आप देख रहे हैं। तो ये जो पोस्ट ट्रूथ की पॉलिटिक्स है, उसका ट्रम्प के बगैर हाउ यू सी थिंग्स विल अनरेवल फॉर द वर्ल्ड, कुछ होप इसमें है?
I think as hopeful as we are today, for us to feel elections can change culture, that's an incorrect assessment. मुझे लगता है कि हम लोग एक सिंकिंग शिप में थे और हम लोग को लाइफ वेस्ट देके पानी में निकाल दिया, तो we didn't go down with the ship, but the lifeboat hasn't come in yet. So we're floating in the ocean with our life vest and hoping. So I think there's more political enforcement that we need. I think as Badisha and Manish have been saying, कि अभी जो है just bare minimum जो है हम लोगों ने achieve किया है. I think there has to be more reinforcement politically, maybe a bigger majority in the Senate, more seats in the House, and then so on and so forth. And that's true everywhere in the world. I mean, democracy everywhere, progressives everywhere are, actually some of them are not even there. But coming back to the post-truth part, and who knows what Trump does? One of my predictions has been that, he's going to contest again in 2024. The person's ego is so big that he cannot accept defeat. And if he does accept defeat, he'll be ready to fight back. He does have 70 million people who voted for him. I was telling somebody कि ये पहला election है जब मैंने देखा है कि दो candidate हमेशा US presidential election में दो main candidate होते हैं, and typically one is a beloved candidate and the other is the other candidate, right? Rarely you have two beloved candidates, but I've rarely seen the beloved candidate actually lose. So Biden was not a beloved candidate. Trump was the beloved candidate, and that's why you see, despite all the polls, etc., he got so close to winning. So he has a ready-made base. वो अच्छा है, बुरा है, उनकी क्या thinking है, who knows? He has an outlet like Fox News, जो कि relies commercially on that base. So he has an infrastructure to sustain some momentum. The question is, does he have it in him to be out of power for 4 years? He's a lazy man in some sense, He picked it up very late in the game and he did a lot of campaigning, and I give credit to him for that. At 74, he was like doing 8-9 rallies a day. I couldn't do half of that, and he's traveling, and it's amazing. The guy has tremendous endurance. There's no question about it. But I think we have to see what the Republicans want to do. There's a midterm election in 2022 to see how the political dynamic changes. So I think for the next 2 years, hopefully Trump will just lay low, and he has a lot of legal troubles, by the way. He has a lot of financial troubles. So, and now that he's out he's not, the Department of Justice is not there to help him out and defer investigation, etc., etc. तो उसका खुद का जो है, उनका खुद का जो personal exposure है, वो uncertain है. But if he theoretically survives these next 2 years, and जब तक Republican primary दोबारा नहीं शुरू होता, I think we'll have to see. I think people are already saying that who's going to challenge him? Because anybody who challenges Trump has to antagonize the base he already has. अगर कोई challenger आता है जो कि उस base को antagonize करता है, उस base को गुस्सा दिलाता है और कहता है कि Trump गलत है, तो that challenger cannot win anything because the Republican Party is just so with him. 90% of the people who claim to be Republican voted for him. Yes. So it's just there's no oxygen there, ideological oxygen there. There's no demographic oxygen there for anybody else to come in. And my fear actually is that Trump can only be out-Trumped. He cannot be moved to the left, which is, the funny part is a lot of people compare Trump to Mussolini. I think the Mussolini can still be born, unfortunately. Trump may not be the Mussolini. India का उदाहरण देना नहीं पड़ेगा मुझे कि आप जानते हैं कि मोदी जी के उत्तराधिकारी कौन है. ज़्यादा दूध देखने की जरूरत नहीं है. So what comes after the ground breaking, right winger is even more dangerous.
Yes.
So we have to be very careful in projecting where this is going to go. I think we have to be very, very vigilant, and Biden is a smart man in that regard. He knows that the threat is not over by any stretch of the imagination. I wish I had a more hopeful message, but we have to be clear-eyed about this. So I'll stop there.
Professor Vidisha, just want to add one thing on this, that besides the personalities like Trump and Modi, the leaders like that, they contribute a lot to post-truth era, the hate mongering in society, the polarization of population. The other factor which works as a catalyst is social media. And it's a hate is their business model. Do you think that coming out from the long shadow of Trump, will the Democratic Party regime now will put some checks and balances on Facebook also?
Prashantji, that is my biggest worry too, is that, Modi will die, but Facebook will not. And here we are on Facebook. This is a very big problem. I think between the two political parties, the Democratic Party is more committed to putting limitations on the kind of power that Facebook and Twitter have. But I also think that Facebook and Twitter are bigger than the US Congress now. And in many ways, they're bigger than the US government now. So that is what still keeps me up at night, is what can we do to limit what social media actors are doing. And I think ultimately, regulation matters, but I think people like us, we have to find a way to get more control over what social media is doing. Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter. I mean, these models just have they have a business logic and a power of their own that nobody can control, right? Maybe not even Trump. So we have to find a way to get ahead of that. And I don't know what that is, but I think you're right that is the biggest danger we face today.
Yes. Professor Manish, coming to you with the question that, कैसे रिफ्लेक्शन होगा, जैसे आज हमारे पास बिहार के भी एग्जिट पोल आ गए, हालांकि एग्जिट पोल है लेकिन काफी अनुमान है कि बिहार में भी बीजेपी हार रही है और नीतीश कुमार जाएंगे और महागठबंधन तेजस्वी यादव वगैरह आएंगे, जो सेकुलर बंच ऑफ पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज है वो वापस पावर में बिहार में आ रहे हैं. ये फिनोमेना पूरी दुनिया में असर एक डालेगा. मैं ये नहीं कह रहा हूँ कि बिहार का कोई अमेरिका की पॉलिटिक्स से कोई असर आ गया, लेकिन यहाँ के डोमेस्टिक इश्यूज थे, लेकिन एक बड़े पैमाने पर असर तो सब जगह आएगा. तो 2024 में जब हम इलेक्शन में जाएंगे भारत के, तो ये कितना ट्रिकल डाउन होगा पॉलिटिकल नैरेटिव जो बाइडेन के वहां रहने से इंडियन पॉलिटिक्स में?
I think काफी होगा मेरे हिसाब से. And it's I think again, looking at the premises that I talked about in the last conversation also, America for the large part is considered as the fountainhead of global politics. We have seen its impact, whether it's in Brazil, whether it's in Turkey, whether it's in India now, obviously, we see that. So I feel that definitely by Indians looking at that now, Americans have rejected the politics of hate, the divisiveness, the polarization, the othering of based on the religion. So that it will definitely have an impact. And I genuinely believe that Indians are very smart people. The only problem where I see with our system in India is that we don't have an understanding of what participative democracy means. If you speak to an average Indian, for them democracy is only voted in 2019. Now they're going to vote in 2024. What happens between 2019 and 2024, it's like, we can't do much, right? So Lay's ka ek ad aata tha, teda hai par mera hai. So it's kind of, so now they have elected Modi government, so now they're going to just make do with that. And that is what you find a difference in a very strong democracy like America. where you had people like Trump, who was derailing the agenda of US, global politics and its positioning. And there were active voices from the opposition, from the civil rights community, from the opposition voices in itself, who always spoke about in up in arms, including the media. So there was this whole idea of the participative democracy. So I feel that what Indians can learn, and from what your viewers can learn, is that we have to shift our focus from just thinking that we have one vote every 5 years to looking at how we hold ourselves also accountable to participating in the democracy. Now, what that participation in the democracy means is questioning your leaders. Today, Indians should be able to question Modi government to saying that how dare he come in America and endorse a political candidate for presidency in America.
Yes.
That should be a mainstream political narrative in India at this point. I know it was there when Howdy Modi had just happened, but that should come back again. So having those voices in the system, I know that people like us, we can't change the political narrative on just on a whim. But when you have more people coming together and asking the political powers to be asking the right questions, that is what is going to put them back in the dock and strengthening the participative democracy aspect of that. That's one. And as a result of the participative democracy, and I hope in the next 4 years, I mean, technology is changing overnight. We have seen that, in 15 years ago, Facebook wasn't there the way it is now, right? So hopefully Facebook has also integrated some of the fact checking, which obviously, we don't know how well that works, but hopefully I would say in the next 3-4 years, you will see some newer ventures coming up who will be immediately doing some, on the go fact checks. And just like we see on Twitter, when Trump posts something, then you already
Yes,
see
they
Twitter saying that this is not an accurate news, or we're going to suppress that news. So hopefully with the technological shift, because one thing we have to understand that when we're speaking about free speech, if I'm going to curtail your free speech, then I'm also going to limit my own free speech also. So free speech is a very, very dicey area, right? So we have to be very cautious of that. And I'm being a very fierce, advocate for a free speech. I'm not endorsing anybody to say an outright lie. My stance would be that yes, you can say what you want to say, but then I will have the mechanism to counter your narrative by a truth. So that is where I hope in the next 3-4 years we will see some technological companies coming up, and hopefully Facebook and Twitter being responsible, companies knowing the bandwidth they have, knowing the power they have to influence the voices, will have those inherent checks and balances in making sure that people are getting the right information. Because what we saw with Trump campaign and even with Modi's campaign, they have won primarily on disinformation. Today, when you saw Prime Minister Modi coming from Ramlila Maidan and saying that we don't have any detention center in our country, right, back in December after the
Yes.
CAA politics had taken full blown,
Yes.
that was an outright blatant lie altogether.
Yes.
Now, just because they have the bandwidth, they have the followings, so people believe that, and there's nobody then to counter that. So you say a lie and say it 10 times and it becomes a truth. So I think that, so answering back to your question, in the next 3-4 years, I hope that that Indians in India, really imbibe the concept of participative democracy, where they question their MLAs, their MPs, their prime minister. There's nothing, it doesn't take much on that. That is one. And the second is hopefully the technological companies, like Facebook, Twitter, because they have their offices, obviously in every country they have an office there. So we don't want that Facebook is run by someone, a spokesperson of BJP, which is what we saw. What was the name of this woman who had to resign?
Aki Das.
Yes, Akidas, right? So she was pretty much seen as a spokesperson of how she was running the BJP policies. There were many disturbing posts or many disturbing content released by the BJP political leaders. And she, as per their policy, they didn't flag it, right? Which ideally speaking, it should have been flagged. So that independence within the technological platform from the political independence is as critical as that possible. So when we, and just wrapping it up, when we talk about strong democracies, right, the strong democracies thrive on independence of systems, right, whether it's from the executive, the judiciary, the media as the fourth pillar, as we say. And today, Facebook and Twitter and all these social media, the new media, is also part of that structure, which has to be independent from these different offices that we're talking about. So hopefully that independence will also be realized by these companies, and making sure that people, at the end of the day, we as consumers, right, because we are the consumer of the information that is shared, whether it's by Facebook or Twitter and the likes. So we are making sure that we want to make sure that we are getting the right information. And as a company CEO, CTO, what have you, content creators, companies will have to make sure that happens, and hopefully the citizens will ask for that. So that's my kind of where I'm hoping that 2024 will in terms of the post-truth world you're talking about. We saw that this post-truth world will not survive a lot more after America has rejected it in this election.
Yes, yes.
प्रशांत जी, मैं एक छोटा सा कमेंट करना चाहता हूँ कि I just don't want our viewers to feel कि elections don't have consequences. This is a absolutely monumental moment. I would say कि inspiration can and does travel at the speed of light.
Yes.
ये कैंपेन दिखाता है कि decency, dignity, even if they're embodied in imperfect people. अब जो बाइडेन को मान लीजिए कि perfect candidate नहीं थे, कमला हैरिस completely progressive नहीं है, but nobody can argue that they ran a dignified campaign on
मतलब
substantive issues.
आप रोहित इशारा कर रहे हैं कि राहुल गांधी को खुश होना चाहिए इससे।
मैं ये इशारा कर रहा हूँ कि भारत में जो भी युवा इस वक्त राजनीति में जाने के लिए तत्पर है, तैयार है, रेडी है, उसको ऐसी लीडरशिप एम्बाइब करनी है, ऐसी लीडरशिप, ऐसा नेतृत्व खड़ा करना है जो कि मुद्दों पर सटीक हो, जो कि मुद्दों पर राजनीति करने से डरे नहीं. And that is the takeaway here, that you can win an election. It'll be close, it'll be tight, कि अगर आप सही मार्ग पे चल रहे हैं, and that is actually very Gandhian in nature, right? कि अगर आपके साथ सत्य है तो सत्यमेव जयते होता ही है. There is no other way. समय लगेगा.
कोविड होना जरूरी है.
कोविड तो है. I mean,
Professor Vidisha, just the concluding remarks from you on this also. What Rohit is saying is is very sugar coated, and it's really I wish it could happen in India, but the problem is that in America you had a very good media who was questioning every day to Trump. In India, the media scene is really bad. One of the shouting anchor person is now behind bars, but there are dozens of like that. Openly carries out this right-wing agenda. And fascism in 21st century is not 1930s fascism. Genocide of 1930s cannot happen in 21st century. This one lynching is genocide.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So one law is genocide. By one law, if you are putting a section of society as second-class citizen, is a genocide. It cannot, 1930s, genocide what Hitler did. So how you see with this kind of media, do you see any hope for India that, these positive signals will come, as we are a very close world and, we exchange things?
So Shanji, let's go back to, go ahead, Vidisha.
So I would remind everybody that, America has been a democracy for almost 250 years now, right? It has been around as a democracy its entire existence. Compared to that, India is an old country, but it is not an old democracy. So India's institutions are very, very new, and therefore they're more fragile. And in America, as we've already said, even given this long-standing institutions, we have seen how much they can be shaken by the post-truth world, by one president, by one political party. So India's road ahead, I think, is more perilous because its institutions are weaker. But I agree fully with Rohit that the inspiration from this victory in America is that this was a grassroots movement. I mean, women and men and young people from election day of 2016 have worked for this, and it was not easy. But what we all did, what someone like me who's a naturalized new citizen did, is that every day we just put in the work, and we got a very small victory in numbers, but it's a huge victory in terms of not just morality, but in terms of what ordinary people can do. And to people who want to do the same in India, the path will be more hard because the institutions are weaker, because the media is not behind the truth right now. But it can be done. If it can be done in America, it can be done anywhere. It's just it's a different pathway.
Yeah,
because
four years ago it was started, not my president, and finally
right.
that has been succeeded.
And also we have to realize one thing very quickly is that in like as Bidisha mentioned, in the last 250 years of presidency, Biden happens to be, I believe, fourth or fifth president to remove a first time president, right? Because otherwise you always have an incumbent president getting a second term. So you can imagine that what kind of political shift has happened, despite as much as yes, Trump has gotten those 70 million votes, but there was this huge anger against his politics, obviously, that you saw that of that this again in fifth time in 250 years of country's history, political history, that you have an incumbent president not getting a second term, and that is a big deal.
Mhm.
Prashant ji,
Quick comments, Rohit ji, before
yeah,
I
I just
wind
want
up
to add. Sure.
on this good morning in America. How good this morning is.
विदिशा और मनीष ने दो बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट बातें कही हैं। विदिशा ने कहा कि ग्रासरूट्स मूवमेंट था। नंबर 2, मनीष ने कुछ समय पहले कहा कि डेमोक्रेसी डज नॉट लिव ओनली एट इलेक्शन टाइम, इट ब्रीथ्स थ्रू आउट। आप इट्स नॉट कि आपने पानी में डुबकी मारी और 4 साल बाद लाइक अ व्हेल यू कम बैक अप, यू टेक अ ब्रेथ एंड यू गो बैक अगेन, राइट? दैट इज नॉट हाउ इट शुड वर्क, दैट इज नॉट डजंट वर्क। फिर आपने पूछा कि राहुल गांधी को क्या मैसेज देना चाहिए सर? राहुल गांधी को ये मैसेज देना चाहिए कि जब तक कि हर लोकेलिटी में एक राहुल गांधी नहीं खड़ा होगा, डिसेंट्रलाइजेशन ऑफ लीडरशिप नहीं होगी, पॉलिटिकल पावर नहीं, डिसेंट्रलाइजेशन ऑफ लीडरशिप, टू डिफरेंट थिंग्स। विकेंद्रीकरण जो है वो नेतृत्व का होना चाहिए, ना कि सत्ता का। सत्ता तो तब आएंगे जब वो विकेंद्रीकरण नेतृत्व का होगा, लीडरशिप का होगा। So you cannot put the cart before the horse. ग्रासरूट लेवल पे कितना काम हुआ है। जॉर्जिया में जो बाइडेन चुनाव जीता है वो सीएनएन की वजह से नहीं जीता है कि सीएनएन बड़ा स्ट्रांग था जॉर्जिया में। सीएनएन वाज स्ट्रांग एवरीवेयर, सेम थिंग, राइट? जॉर्जिया में स्टेसी एब्राम्स जैसी जो लेडीज हैं, जो लोकल लीडर्स हैं, जो सालों से वोटर सप्रेशन के खिलाफ काम कर रही हैं, जिन्होंने अटलांटा के सबर्ब्स से बाहर निकलकर डेमोक्रेटिक बेस को बढ़ाया है, घर घर जाके नॉक कर करके कैनवसिंग की है, वोटर रजिस्ट्रेशन ड्राइव्स की हैं, they have won this election. And that is the inspiration that people should get in India and everywhere in the world, that the work of democracy never stops. As Vidisha is saying, every day she's doing something or the other. And that is how it lives. If people in India or anywhere else in the world become armchair citizens, then we're not going to achieve anything. It's just a matter of time before we get completely overtaken by darker forces. So that is the hope is कि इस इलेक्शन को आप politically नहीं बल्कि grassroots activism के एंगल से डायसेक्ट करें और देखेंगे कितनी एनर्जी गई है और किस तरह की एनर्जी गई है और कहां से एनर्जी गई है। If we don't develop local leaders in India who are connected with the people, it doesn't matter which celebrity we pick as the chief minister or as the prime minister. It does not matter. So if there's any message for the Congress party or any progressive entity in India, this is the message. And the funny part is the BJP is actually going on the wrong track there because they're not developing this. So there's an opportunity for प्रगतिशील जो ताकतें हैं उनके पास अभी मौका है कि वो ग्रासरूट लेवल पे, जमीनी लेवल पे अपनी लीडरशिप बना सकते हैं. The question is, will they do it? And don't make excuses कि हमारा मीडिया नहीं है, ये नहीं है, वो नहीं है. No one's stopping you to going to your local leaders, अपने कार्यकर्ताओं को प्रेरित करने के लिए कि भाई ये काम करो. So I'll end there. Thank you.
बिहार एग्जाम्पल है. बिहार एग्जाम्पल है.
See, for that they have to identify the right issues there also, right? I mean, one is the leadership aspect of it, but also identifying the right issues to talk about is also very important. And that is where I believe that the left and the progressives in India do have that advantage. You know, I would say that BJP probably, with the kind of organization they have as a political party, if you remove the Hindu-Muslim, the communal plank from them, they could do a lot for the country. But clearly, if you remove the Hindu-Muslim plank from BJP, then it is not BJP anymore.
Yeah, they would cease to exist.
Exactly. So that's where the left politics do have a lot of onus on identifying the right issues. You know, we talked about the grassroots. Grassroots mein you can activate people, but again, you are activating people on the issues that impact their day-to-day life. And identifying those issues with the people is sort of intersectionality that we have to look for moving forward, in my view.
इसी संदेश के साथ भारत के राजनेताओं के लिए एक बहुत पॉजिटिव संदेश अमेरिका के लोगों ने ट्रम्प को हरा के दिया है और हम भारत के लोग भी इस तरीके की सकारात्मक पॉलिटिक्स कर सकते हैं और बहुत अच्छा गहरा डिस्कशन हुआ, तमाम मुद्दों पे बात हुई हमारे पैनलिस्ट से। प्रोफेसर विदिशा, प्रोफेसर मनीष, रोहित त्रिपाठी, आपका बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया फ्रीडम एक्सप्रेस
थैंक यू।
से 1.25 घंटे तक बात करने के लिए। और अच्छी सुबह है आप लोगों की, जाएं सेलिब्रेट करें, बढ़िया वीकेंड है। और मैं तस्वीरें अभी देख रहा था कि वॉशिंगटन की सड़कों पे जुलूस जश्न चल रहा है, तो आप भी इसमें शामिल हो। और बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया। दर्शकों से भी
Thank
बहुत
you.
बहुत विदा लेते हैं। और इसके पहले कि हम विदा लें, एक छोटा सा संदेश कि हम फ्रीडम एक्सप्रेस एक नॉन प्रॉफिट मीडिया हाउस है। हम पैसा कमाने के लिए मीडिया हाउस नहीं चला रहे हैं, ना हम कॉर्पोरेट के विज्ञापनों पे चलते हैं। हम लोगों के, आप लोगों का मीडिया हाउस है और आपकी मदद से चलता है। तो फ्रीडम एक्सप्रेस को अपनी मदद करते रहें, लाइक शेयर भी करते रहें। बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया। थैंक यू।